The Byakugan didn't suddenly get weaker because Kishimoto forgot how strong it was. It got weaker because the story quietly stopped caring about what it was actually good at, and never gave the Hyuga a reason to adapt. That's the real issue. Not that the eye became useless overnight, but the Naruto kept moving forward while the Byakugan stayed exactly what it started. Early Naruto treats the Byakugan like a problem you don't want to deal with up close. Not flashy, not scary, in a whoa look at that movie way, but uncomfortable. It's invasive. You are being watched from every angle, your chakra is exposed, and if you mess up once, your whole kit can shut down. That's why the gentle fist matters. It's not about the mage numbers, it's about denial. You lose access to what makes you dangerous. And in a series where most characters rely heavily on chakra-based options, that is a big deal. Most people remember Neji versus Hinata or Neji versus Naruto and focus on the outcome, but the more interesting part is how cautious everyone around Van is. Kakashi doesn't hype the Byakugan because it's hair, he hypes it because it creates bad situations fast. You don't brute force a Hyuga, you either outplay Van or you overwhelm Van. That framing matters because it tells you what the Byakugan is supposed to represent: control, not dominance. And for a while, that whole works. The Hyuga aren't carrying fights with a spectacle, but they don't need to. Their presence change how fights are approached. You don't spend techniques when someone can literally see your chakra flow. You don't hide tricks when someone has near total visual coverage. The Byakugan doesn't steal the spotlight, it limits the room everyone else gets to shine. The problem starts when Naruto as a story begins prioritizing escalation over restriction. As the series progresses, fights stopping being about denying options and starting being about surviving bigger and bigger exchanges. The narrative slowly drifts away from how do I stop my opponent from acting toward how much can I endure before I fall. That shift alone already puts the Byakugan at a disadvantage because its strengths don't scale naturally with that direction. Fans often say the Sharingan overshadowed the Byakugan, but that's only kinda how through. The real issue isn't that the Sharingan gets stronger, but rather that it gets more versatile and ways the plot actively rewards. Copying techniques, hitting movements, casting genjutsus, evolving into specialized abilities, all of that feeds directly into longer, more complex battles. The Sharingan adapts as the story demands more layers, the Byakugan doesn't adapt at all. And that's not because it couldn't, it's because the Hyuga never change how they fight. That's the part that gets overlooked usually when talking about this. The Byakugan itself stays consistent, seeing chakras, seeing through objects, wide-angle vision, none of that is contradicted later. What changes is the environment around it. More characters rely less on visible chakra networks, more fights happen at ranges where the gentle fist pressure never becomes a factor, where opponents don't care if one pathway shuts down because they have backups, transformations, or even half physical advantage. At that point, the Byakugan doesn't feel weak, it feels rather ignored. Looking how often Hyuga characters are used in Shippuden, when they appear, it's usually for scouting or observation or brief sport moments. That's not because those are the only things the Byakugan can do, it's because those are the only roles the story still has room for it. Combat scenes aren't designed around precision anymore, they are designed around endurance, surprise abilities, and fucking giant avatars. Neji is the clearest example of this stagnation. He starts as a prodigy, someone who mastered his clan's techniques early and refined them as well. But what does his growth look like after that? More rotations, stronger palms, better control, all improvements within the same narrow lane. Meanwhile, other characters branch outward. They learn new styles, combine tools, add layers to how they approach fights. Neji never does that, not because he isn't capable, but because the story never pushes him to. The Hyuga style becomes static, and static fighting styles don't survive in a series that keeps reinventing its combat language. People sometimes argue that the Byakugan needed an evolution to stay relevant, but that misses the entire point. An upgrade wouldn't fix the real problem, which is that the clan never rethinks how they uses what they have. If you give the Byakugan a new form but keep the same gentle fist mindset, you just get a strong version of the same limitation. What's actually missing is experimentation. There is no reason a Hyuga should be locked into close range denial forever. Seeing chakra doesn't just help you block it, it helps you understanding time, restraint build-up, imbalance. A Byakugan user should be able to disrupt techniques mid-formation, pressure weak points from a distance, or coordinate with allies in ways no other ninja can. But none of that is actually explored because the clan culture itself never evolves. And that cultural stagnation is important. The Hyuga aren't writing as innovators, they are writing as traditionalists. The internal conflict revolves around hierarchy, not growth. The branch family suffers under the system, but even that conflict never becomes a catalyst for changing how the clan operates. Once that tension fades, though does the opportunity for reinventation. So when Shippuden introduces stronger enemies, broader abilities, and faster pacing, the Hyuga don't fall behind behind because the Byakugan is kind of bad. They fail behind because they are still fighting yesterday's battles. That's why moments where the Byakugan does matter stand out so much. When it's used to note subtle chakra manipulation or detect something others miss, it reminds you that the eye still works exactly as advertised. It just isn't placed in situations where that advantage decides outcomes. The story doesn't build fights around it anymore, and once that happens, perception shifts. Viewers don't think the Byakugan is situational. They think the Byakugan is actually weak, not because its abilities change it, but because the narrative stopped framing them as central. This also explains why later attempts to make the Byakugan feel important again feel awkward. When you try to retroactively elevate something without first integrating it into the ongoing logic of the story, it doesn't land naturally, it feels bolted on. Instead of showing how the Hyuga adapted over time, the story jumps straight to cosmic explanations and inherent significance, skipping the part where relevance is actually earned, and that creates a weird disconnect. The Byakugan becomes more important on paper but less impactful in practice. At this point, the eye isn't failing, the storytelling around it is. The series moved toward escalation, a spectacle, and adaptability, and the Byakugan was left tied to a single and crazily narrow interpretation of combat. Until that gap is addressed, no amount of lore layering can really fix the perception problem. Because the question isn't why the Byakugan got weaker, it's why the Hyuga never learned how to use it differently as the world around them changed. Now going back a little bit, what makes the later attempts so frustrating isn't that they give the Byakugan attention, but rather that they give it importance without function. The story starts saying this eye matters a lot actually, but never answers the more relevant questions like matters how exactly in the kind of fight Naruto has become about. By the time Shippuden is deep into its run, the series has a very clear combat language. Characters win fights by stacking advantage, mobility, layered defense, unpredictable abilities, and options that force the opponent to react instead of plan. Even characters who aren't top tier monsters survive by being flexible. They don't rely on one win condition, they pivot constantly, and this is where the Byakugan's problem becomes impossible to actually ignore, because the Hyuga don't pivot enough. They still approach combat as if shutting down chakra flow like is the end goal, even when the narrative has moved on to opponents who don't fold once that happens. Plenty of characters can fight through injury, externalize their power, or simply switch modes entirely. Some barely rely on traditional chakra circulation at all. In that environment, precision denial isn't useless, but it's no longer decisive on its own, and the story never shows the Ryuga responding to that shift. Instead, the Byakugan gets reframed in a very different way. Rather than being a tool that demands adaptation, it becomes a symbol, something ancient, something inherited, something tied to origins rather than outcomes. That is a huge tonal change. Early Naruto treats bloodline abilities as starting points. Later Naruto starts treating them as destiny markers, and that change benefits some abilities way more than others. The Sharingan thrives in that framework because it's writing to grow alongside its users. Its relevance isn't just historical, it's reactive. Each new stage answers a new narrative need. The Byakugan doesn't do that. When it's brought back into focus, it's usually through lore reveals instead of combat evolution. We are told it's significant, but we're not shown new ways it alters decision making a fight. That's why the alien ancestry stuff feels so hollow. Not because it's weird, I mean Naruto is full of weird shit, but because it doesn't solve the practical issue. Knowing the Byakugan came from an ancient source doesn't explain why modern Hyuga still fight like it's the tuning exam. Origins don't compensate for stagnation, and this is where the Tenseigan becomes a perfect example of the problem. It's introduced as an answer to the question people kept asking, what's the Byakugan's next step? But instead of emerging from Hyuga practice, philosophy, or even experimentation, it comes from a completely separate context. Different setting, different rules, different stakes. It doesn't feel like a culmination of Hyuga combat at all. It feels more like a detached extension. More importantly, it doesn't reframe how the Byakugan is used, it just raises the scale of what happens around it. Bigger effects, bigger consequences, same disconnect. You're not watching a Hyuga push the abilities in a new direction, you're watching the story assign power to an eye because it needs the plot to move. I mean, like the Sharingan, but anyway, that's why none of it sticks. If you strip away the lore, the Hyuga's role in the story never really recovers. The internal conflict fades without resolution, the fighting style stays narrow, the presence in major arcs is mostly reactive, and because Naruto is a series that increasingly rewards characters who force the story to bend around them, that passivity becomes fatal to relevance. What's wild is that the Byakugan is actually better suited for high-level combat than people actually give it credit for, just not in the way the story chooses to depict high-level combat. Information is everything at the top. Timing, positioning, coordination, misdirection. The Byakugan Byakugan is an information monster, but Naruto hardly frames information as a win condition by itself once the power ceiling rises on Shippuden. When information does decide things, it's usually tied to deception or surprise, which again favors abilities that obscure or rewrite perception rather than clarify it. Seeing everything clearly is less valuable in a story that increasingly revolves around things you're not meant to see coming at all. And as the final irony, the Byakugan didn't fail because it couldn't keep up, it failed because the story stopped valuing clarity. Early Naruto rewards understanding your opponent better than they understand you. Later Naruto rewards overwhelming than before understanding even matters, and that shift in an eye built around observation and precision naturally loses its narrative priority, not because it's bad, but rather because it contradicts the direction the series leans into. So when people say the Byakugan got nerfed, that's not really accurate at all. Its capabilities don't diminish. What diminishes is the number of situations where those capabilities are allowed to matter. The Hyuga don't get to shape battles anymore. I mean, we never did, but they just participate in them, and that's why all the retroactive importance never lands. You can't fix a relevance problem by increasing lore weight. You fix it by changing how characters interacted with conflict, and Naruto never does that for the Hyuga. By the time they start to realize something feels off, it's already too late to organically course correct. The tragedy of the Byakugan isn't that it lost to the Sharingan, it's that it was never given permission to evolve alongside the story's idea of what strength actually looks like. If you enjoyed this breakdown, like the video, subscribe to the channel please, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos.